So, good morning everyone. In this topic, we are going to see the rail gauges. So, rail gauge means the clear minimum perpendicular distance between the inner faces of the two rails, as shown in the diagram. So, in Indian Railways, based on the perpendicular distance, inner distance between the rails, are termed as rail gauges. This gauge distance is mainly affecting the speed of the train movement and some other factors. So we are going to discuss in brief. So the factors are the traffic condition. So what about traffic condition? If the intensity of traffic is more, then the gauge distance will be wider. So basically in Indian Railway there are 4 types of gauges: broad gauge, standard gauge, meter gauge and narrow gauge. So from ascending order, broad gauge is having wide gauge distance, and next standard gauge, next meter gauge, and the very narrow gauge is a shorter width between the inner gauges. So if the traffic condition, the intensity is heavy, then we go for the broad gauge. So the main factor affecting. Next one, development of poor areas. So in the areas they are having no connecting modes of transport, then we are going to lay any of the gauge, so like narrow gauge or standard gauge. On that point, we are not going for the speed or high productivity. And next factor is cost of the track. So again, the cost of the track also increase with the width of the gauges. Okay, so in compared with the narrow gauge, the broad gauge is very costly. Okay, so if the fund available is not sufficient to construct a standard gauge, then a meter gauge or a narrow gauge is also preferred based on the fund availability. Okay, because it is better to know railways at all. And another one is speed of movement. So the movement of speed will increase with respect to the gauge width. So a broad gauge has high speed when compared with the narrow gauge or a standard gauge. And finally, nature of country. So nature or topography of country is highly affecting the gauge distance. So if it is a flat terrain, then we go for broad gauge or any standard gauge. But in a hilly terrain or mountainous country, it is advisable to construct a narrow gauge. Okay, that will be sufficient. So these are the major factors which are affecting the gauge distance. So then the types of gauges in Indian Railways. So first one, meter gauge. Meter gauge is having 1000 mm. So center to center distance between the inner rails. The distance will be 1435 meter in case of standard gauge, and for broad gauge it will be 1676 mm. In Indian Railways, most of the railway tracks are converted as a broad gauge, except some exception. So we are going to discuss about that. So broad gauge, it is also called wide gauge or large line. The gauge distance will be 1676 mm. So first broad gauge line in India was Porbandar to Thane in 1853, and also used for ports and crane movements. This gauge will be better stability and better than other type of gauges. So widely used in Indian Railways is broad gauge. Next, standard gauge. In gauge distance for the standard gauge is 1435 mm. It's highly used for urban transit system or urban rail transit system or metro, then mono, so, and also in tram system. In Kolkata, we are having tram system. So for that also use the standard gauge. Now the emerging metro, Delhi metro, Mumbai metro, all the major cities are having metro. So standard gauge is a track for the metro system. And meter gauge. So meter gauge is a single meter, 1 meter. The gauge distance is 1 meter or 1000 mm. So this gauge track for light to reduce the cost. Okay, in Indian Railways, the Nilagiri Mountain Railway is the only meter gauge line presently in operation. Some other standard gauges or meter gauges are also available, but they are not in operation, and they are converting and will be converted to another narrow gauge, meter gauge to broad gauge or standard gauge. And last one, the narrow gauge. Narrow gauge, the gauge distance will be 762 mm. Okay. So this gauge is also called as small gauge or small line. But these gauge lines are converted to big line like standard gauge or broad gauge based on the capacity and the availability we are converting. In Indian Railway, Darjeeling Mountain and Kalka Shimla Railway are the popular narrow gauge railways presently in operation. So these are some exemption in railways other than the broad gauges, because commercially all gauges are converted to broad gauges. In the special case like any hilly regions, they are only operated as other smaller gauges. Okay, thank you.